were advised to pull the bunks away from the walls and always leave the top bunk unoccupied, so that if there was anything did fall, they had a better chance.
That was Juliet Gardner talking about the experiences of people who lived in Chislehurst Caves during the Second World War.
And I realised just before the film ran out that he wasn't here. He'd disappeared completely into some other world. Where he was back at Passchendaele.
And that was Julia Cave, recounting her experiences of interviewing First World War veterans. Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast. My name is Rob Attar and I'm the editor of BBC History magazine, which is the UK's best-selling history magazine. You can find it in all good newsagents, or you could take out a subscription from anywhere in the world. See historyextra.com/subscribe-today for subscription deals. We also have digital editions available for the iPad, Kindle, Kindle Fire, Google Play and Zinio. For details of all of these, head to historyextra.com/digital. Faced with the prospect of aerial bombardment during the Second World War, the people of Britain often had to find shelter wherever they could. One such location was at Chislehurst Caves in Kent, which became a wartime retreat for thousands of people. We sent our books editor, Matt Elton, to visit the cave in the company of Juliet Gardner, a leading historian of the home front in the Second World War.
We're here in Chislehurst Caves. What can we see around us?
Well, we're actually sitting at the moment, we're sitting at the entrance to what was known as the cathedral, but in fact is more like a church, but it is part of the caves. And there's an altar and there are seats for people to have, for church services. It was consecrated by the Bishop of Rochester in 1941 and it hasn't been deconsecrated. Okay. So in theory it could still be used for services.
Fantastic, excellent. And this is just part of a huge network of tunnels, isn't it?
Yes, it's caves is actually a misnomer. They're not natural caves. They were formed. They're man-made in the sense that they were formed as mines. Chalk. These are on chalk hills, and chalk was mined here. Nobody knows quite when it started, but it certainly is mentioned in an Anglo-Saxon chronicle of the 13th century.
So they're really old.
They're really very old, and they've been used for a number of different purposes, of course. But as I say, it's a bit of a misnomer to call them caves because they were man-made. They're mines, basically. But of course, they're not mined anymore.
No, fantastic. And obviously we're here to talk about their use in the Second World War specifically. But what do we get a sense of their earlier history? What things were they used for before that?
Well, I imagine they were always used a little bit for sort of sheltering in. Now, during the First World War, there was a railway. They were used for mining, and that was what they were originally, not originally, but that's certainly what they were used for in the 19th century. And there was a railway constructed in, I think, 1865, which presumably, again, was to carry, lumps of chalk from deep inside, because there are 3 caves, and the third one, or caverns, let's call them caves.
Yes.
We know they're not really. The third one is very far deep in, quite a distance, so there was a railway constructed. Then during the First World War, they were used as a sort of offshoot of Woolwich Arsenal. They were used to store ammunition in. And in fact, in parts of the caves, you can see sort of little places where it had been burnt, sparks have obviously hit them, and there's a sort of yellowish tinge, which comes from the ammunition. Now, after the First World War, they were used to grow mushrooms, ideal conditions for mushroom growing. The interwar years, they were used for growing mushrooms, and obviously those were picked, and they were taken out, and they were sold, or they were exported, or whatever. But they were also used for preparation for war. They were used for exercises, things like gas attack exercises. Not the real thing, because after the First World War, of course, everybody expected that the next war there would be a gas attack. So there were never gas attacks in this country, and they weren't on battlefields either. But these caves were used for those sort of exercises, And once the war started in September 1939, people did sometimes come here and shelter, but not very many, because there wasn't anything to shelter from, because the phony war lasted for more than, pretty much a year. But it was when the Blitz started, of course, in September 1940, that's when it became a shelter. People came here to shelter. And at one point, I think there were 15,000 people sheltering here, sort of nightly, families, children. There were special trains laid on from Cannon Street to bring Londoners, because of course it was London that took the worst of the Blitz, certainly in the early days. Then it spread out more. So, and of course, originally people would just have to sleep on the bare earth, which must have been very cold. I mean, they might bring a blanket or something like that. But, that was pretty, but gradually, obviously, there was ventilation, sanitation, there were there were food stalls set up, so people often brought their own, thermos and sandwiches and things like that. Bunks were put in. Amazing. There was this church was sort of constructed, and the idea was it was supposed to be a cathedral. I mean, it's pretty small, but it has got a dome which is lined in granite. You can just see it if you have a torch. It has got a dome which is a cupola, really, which is like a cathedral, though of course it was, the size of it makes it much more like a church. There was also a hospital here. There are always rumours I've read that a children's hospital was evacuated here. I don't think that's true. I think the Red Cross set up a hospital for those who were injured, and in fact it was never hit. I mean, so that there wasn't bomb damage, but obviously there were injuries. You can imagine with that number of people here. So the Red Cross set up a hospital, and no doubt people came from the surrounding area to the Red Cross hospital, and there were authorised selling of food and things like that. The WVS helped out. People get cups of tea and canteen, the sort of things that they would have had down the tubes too, Not at first. I mean, everything was pretty primitive at first.
I was going to say, actually, I mean, what would have been the situation like for people who were among the first to stay here? Was it just a case of sleeping on the floor and then going back in the daytime, or did they stay for any length of time?
Normally they would just stay during the daytime, and then they'd go back, they'd stay during the nighttime, because it was a night blitz. Before September 1940, there had been a number of daytime attacks, but it hadn't actually affected around here. And by the start of the Blitz in September 1940, about 1,000 people had already been killed by civilians, had already been killed by enemy action. But people would come here. That's why the special trains were laid on for city workers and people who worked and lived in London, the East End, or wherever was getting, really badly hit by the Blitz. And they'd come out here with their bundles of stuff, blankets, a pillow maybe, stuff for the children, as I said, sandwiches, perhaps a thermos flask, something like that.
So they'd finish work, get the train and come here for the night, and then catch the train home.
Stay the night, have a quick wash, maybe make themselves a cup of tea if they could, and then go back to work in London, or go back to their homes in London. The women and children both go back to school. They didn't live here all the time.
No.
And later on, of course, in the war, 1944, from really just after D-Day until beginning of the early spring of 1945, the V1 and V2 rockets, then people started using the caves again, and they were advised to go into the very deepest cave.
Much deeper than we are here.
Yes, the third cave is it's further into it, it's further away from the mouth, and they were advised to pull the bunks away from the walls and always leave the top bunk unoccupied, so that if there was anything did fall, they had a better chance, let's put it like that. But luckily nothing ever did. So the B1 and B2s were particularly terrifying, of course, because you never knew quite where they were going to fall, and by the time you heard them, it was usually too late. So
you'd hear them in here? You would?
I doubt if you'd hear them here. You might have heard them, near the entrance, I think. But that's what terrified people in their own homes.
Yes, yes.
But that's why, as I said, they were advised to go as deep in as they could.
So it wasn't until 1944 that really the mass staying of people in these caves started?
No, it started in the Blitz. It started in September 1940. And then after the Blitz was over in May the 10th, 1941, though nobody realised at the time that it was over, but it was effectively, though of course there were subsequent enemy attacks, then most people didn't come here.
So there was a period in which people stayed here much less, and then it picked up again?
Or rather, fewer people stayed here, far fewer. But then it picked up again, as it were, when the V1s and V2s started to come, and then but there were never as many as there were during the Blitz. There were perhaps only about 2,000.
Okay.
And maybe some of them no doubt came down from London, some might have come from the local area.
Okay. And at what point did the infrastructure that we hear about, the church, the hospitals, all those kind of things, was that always here, or was there a time when
that was built, during the war, but converted. I mean, hewn, really, I suppose is the word. I mean, they had hew outs and ross. I mean, this would have been a natural. We're looking at the church now, and that would have been a natural cave, but it was sort of made more church-like. There were some sort of pillars and things like that. And the hospital, again, I imagine that the Red Cross just took over the most suitable space. Quite a large space, and they took that over as a hospital.
It's strange to think of all those buildings like an actual community just living down here. It's a strange thing.
And children running around, of course. And by 1944, they had started. There were always rules in the caves, and it was organised. The caves were sort of regulated, if you like, by a committee, which included a vicar, Canon Lum, I think his name was, and it included perhaps, I think, the owner of the caves, and perhaps, I'm sure, one or two representatives from, regular shelterers and that sort of thing, and they regulated it. And originally, you could only, if you didn't use your pitch, they were known as pitches, you had a pitch. If you didn't use your pitch for 20 days, then you lost your right to it. But when the V1s and V2s started to come, then they regulated it down to 3 days, because they reckoned if you hadn't been here for 3 days, chances are you were dead. So, they made rules like lights out had to be at 10:30. There was no music after 9 o'clock. Children had to be in their pitches by 9 o'clock. And the motto really was, come early and stay put.
Fantastic. And what sort of atmosphere do you think would have been down here at this point?
Oh, I think actually people very much, during the Blitz and during the V1s and V2s, they very much liked to be with other people. It could be, you wouldn't know, I think, down here that there was a raid on. You might have heard the siren go. Well, that sort of probably alerted you to come in. But obviously most people came in early, whether there was a raid or not, during the Blitz, because, you couldn't wait till you got on a train and you made it a regular part of your routine. I think the atmosphere, obviously people were a little bit anxious, and they were certainly anxious about those people left outside when there was a raid on. But I think it was, on the whole, it was pretty friendly. It was sort of, people brought their things and they shared things. They must have got to know each other pretty well. You'd get to know the people in the next pitch, or queuing up for a cup of tea or something like that. I think it was quite a jolly atmosphere. There was a choir in the church. There was a piano down here. People used to play the piano and have a sing-song. There were concerts, put on impromptu concerts down here. There would be dancing, and this sort of thing. So it would have been quite there's a lot of space. There was a lot went on. And the Duke of Kent, in fact, visited the caves on a visit, a sort of morale-boosting visit. And he visited, I think, only a couple of days before he was killed in an air crash. He was in the RAF, and so it was a pretty active place, I think, and probably people regarded it as home. They were here so regularly, they regarded it as home.
There's an idea about the war in kind of the popular imagination that it was a period in which everyone banded together, and there was a sense of genuine camaraderie. Is that the case down here then, do you think?
I think there is the case, but I think we must never forget that, I think one of the myths, if you like, of the Second World War is that all class divisions were sort of forgotten or ironed out, and I think that's not true. I think on the whole, these would have been working class people who came here, because often middle class people had an Anderson shelter in their own back garden, or they had had perhaps a basement in their house where they could shelter. So I think a bit like the tubes, on the whole, you would have been sort of working people. So I don't think there was much class intermingling. And but I think on the whole there was quite a bit of camaraderie. And I mean, there was a lot of grumbling, I'm sure, but I'm sure there was a lot of fun too. And it went on for long. I mean, the Blitz went on from September to May the next year. So people needed entertaining. They needed something to do. So, and I thought that would build up camaraderie too.
And there was a baby born down here, wasn't there?
There was a baby. There was one baby was born down here, no doubt, in the Red Cross Hospital down here. And her middle name, I think, was Caverna.
Fantastic. Excellent. And so at what point did the cave stop becoming used? I suppose once the war had finished?
Once the war was over, the caves stopped being used as a shelter in 1945. And there was an attempt apparently to grow mushrooms, but because there'd been so many people down here, the warmth of bodies, it had got too warm for mushroom growing. And also, of course, it wasn't only that, it was also that mushrooms were being imported. It wasn't like Britain was importing much more, was able to import much more food, of course, after the war, because the import of food had been very difficult during the war, very dangerous. And I think there was an attempt to sort of grow mushrooms. It really wasn't successful. So since then, really, it's been a tourist attraction. People come and see and try to imagine what it was like during the Second World War to live this subterranean, this troglodyte life.
Yes. I mean, how much light was there down here? That's the other thing.
Well, of course, we're sitting here pretty much in the dark, but there were lights in all the sort of niches and crannies and nooks and crannies. So that actually there was quite a lot of light. They were pretty light because, of course, they would. I mean, it was dark outside, but of course they're dark down here. And there were all these lights, and there were maps and things. And apparently, people and we sit here imagining getting lost in all these tunnels and things. But it's not actually. I mean, it's quite a big space, but it's not a massive space. And people very soon accustom themselves to thinking, oh yes, that jutting, you need to turn right at that jutting out bit of rock, or there's a candle. Originally, of course, there was only candles for light, but then later on they become paraffin lamps, and eventually electricity was.
That's amazing. They had electricity down here. And I mean, in terms of how common this kind of experience was during the war, are there any other similar sites?
Yes.
There
are similar caves. I mean, there are caves at Ramsgate. There are caves, I think, at Folkestone. There are certainly caves in the north of England where and people would shelter under railway arches. They would shelter down the tube. It's a very natural human instinct when things are raining on you from above to want to burrow down. And so I think people would burrow down wherever there were natural caves or something like this, or maybe mines. A lot of mines, of course, were used during the war, particularly in Wales, for storing national treasures, things like the paintings from the National Gallery and things like that. But yes, I mean, sheltering underground, I mean, some people sheltered in public shelters. People who had a garden could have an Anderson shelter, which was quite effective. But a lot of people, I mean, nothing was effective from a direct hit. I mean, that was it, I'm afraid. But I think, but of course, as the Blitz wore on, people got a bit sort of cavalier, and they would, I mean, sometimes, of course, they would shelter just under the stairs or something like that, but they got a bit cavalier and they got exhausted. I think that's one of the things we must never forget about the Blitz, was it was totally exhausting, because you never got a decent night's sleep. I mean, you got a much better night's sleep down here, and in fact, pilots from our members of the Women's Army Air Force, Auxiliary Air Force, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, who were stationed at Biggin Hill, often came here for a good night's sleep, because they needed to sleep, because they might be they'd be on duty the next day.
That was Juliet Gardiner. Juliet has written a piece about Chislehurst Caves, which appears in the March issue of BBC History magazine, which is out now. Also in this issue, we offer a different perspective on Henry VIII's 6 wives. We explain why the Vikings were such feared seafarers, and we follow the tale of the Chinese Long March. You can get hold of our March edition in all good newsagents and in our digital formats. For For our next section, it's time for the latest history news with our website editor, Emma McFarlane.
The remains of at least 4 people thought to have died in the 19th century have been discovered on the beach of a Ministry of Defence site in Portsmouth Harbour. The remains, revealed following recent storms and flooding, were found at Burrow Island, also known as Rat Island. The site is a known convicts' burial ground. It is possible that the individuals were either convicts or possibly prisoners of war of French or American origin. They likely came from the floating prisons that were moored in the harbour. The remains have been sent to a laboratory to be cleaned and analysed. Researchers hope to be able to identify the sex, age and stature of the individuals. In other news, a High Court battle over where the remains of Richard III should be buried is to get underway on Thursday. The judicial review, which was due to take place last November but was adjourned after the court agreed to allow Leicester City Council to make representations as a party, is expected to last for 2 days. The judicial review will examine the Justice Secretary's decision to authorise the exhumation and reinterment of the monarch's remains in Leicester. It has been brought by a group of Richard III's distant relatives, the Plantagenet Alliance Limited, who are campaigning to see the former king reburied in York. Meanwhile, 2 diaries by a soldier which describe life on the front line during the First World War have been discovered in Devon. They were found by a resident in a chest in her attic when she was moving house in Plymouth. The diaries were written by Herbert Cecil Alger while he was serving in the 1st Royal Devon Yeomanry and cover a period from September 1915 to July 1918. The resident, Valerie Harper, has tried, but so far failed, to find the previous owners of the house to see if she can trace Mr. Alger's family and return his diaries.
Thanks for that, Emma, and don't forget to visit historyextra.com for all the latest history news. Half a century ago, on the 50th anniversary of the First World War, the BBC broadcast its landmark series, The Great War. Produced in conjunction with the Imperial War Museum, The Great War was based on a number of interviews with surviving veterans. Despite the original series being shown over 26 parts, the vast majority of the footage was never broadcast. So now, as we approach the centenary of the conflict, a new film has been made that shows some of this extra material for the first time. Entitled I Was There, it will be broadcast this Friday on BBC Two. Earlier in the week, I headed over to Broadcasting House to meet Julia Cave, who was the original interviewer for the 1964 series. And I began by asking her how she had first become involved in the Great War.
In 1963, Tony Essex, who was one of the producers, came and asked me if I would work in it. I had been working on What's My Line, which was a very popular Sunday night programme where I found the challengers. So I'd been used to going out and finding people, and I think that's perhaps what it was. I also directed the programme. But I said, look, Tony, honestly, I don't really know anything about the First World War. And he said, don't worry about that. He said, here's a book by Barbara Tuchman called The Guns of August. I was just off on holiday. Take that, read it, come back. So that's what I did. And I'm afraid I really didn't know anything much about the First World War until after I'd spent a bit of time working on it. But I came back and found, to my horror, that while I'd been away, Tony had advertised for First World War veterans. And my office, which was in a house in Hammersmith Grove, which was rather an appalling kind of an office. We were all there. And it was down the road from Lime Grove. I think there was no room at Lime Grove for us. And my office was completely full of sacks of mail, completely unacknowledged, and with things sticking out of them like diaries and photographs, even medals, old tobacco tins, because they were given tobacco on the front line, and they kept the tobacco tins as mementos. And all these things were in the sacks.
At this point now, there must have been millions and millions of First World War veterans still alive, and how did you choose from all of those which ones would go on the series?
Well, that's a long and complicated question, because the people had written in who were in their thousands. Obviously millions of them may well have been alive, but also probably many millions of them didn't want to talk about it, because, as you will have heard, a lot of them came home from the front and really didn't want to burden their relatives in particular with what had happened there. They didn't really talk about it. But Tony had advertised, this is Tony Essex, had advertised, and there was a big response. So obviously these were people who did want to talk. And they'd written their memoirs out very carefully, and obviously I'm afraid that I didn't have time to read absolutely all of them, because some of them are quite frankly illegible for a start. Anyway, I had to choose from these which ones I thought might be suitable for interview. And I thought, well, I'd better get them to ring me up so I can hear how they speak anyway. And then if they sound sort of possible, I'll have them up to Lime Grove for an interview. And then Tony came to me and said, we need about 80 veterans within 2 weeks, because I've booked Ealing Film Studios to do interviews, and I want you to do 8 interviews a day. So I had to really get my skates on. So one way and another, I had phone ringing all the time, trying to interview people on the phone and then invite them up for interviews at Lime Grove, which I did there, and chose the ones that I thought would probably speak well about it. And then we had to consider, of course, the front where they were, the campaign where they were, the section of the army they'd been in, whether they were officers or men. I mean, we had Navy people as well, and we had quite a few Australians also, although we were doing co-production with ABC Television, so they sort of found some of the Australian veterans. And so I chose out of those who we could possibly interview on film.
Was the experience of interviewing them as you'd imagined it would be, or did something surprise you, some of the things they told you or the way they came across?
I had no concept of what I was going to find, so nothing surprised me.
Right.
I had no idea what they would be like. I didn't know if they would talk sense or not. I had a few close encounters, odd things happening to me, like one of them chased me around the desk with an imaginary bayonet. Some various very odd things happened, and some of them were distinctly not quite sensible. And you could tell pretty well at once whether they were going to be talking. One of the problems was, were they telling the truth? Now that took me a little while to find out. I had to get kind of used to the whole feel of it before I could find out if they were telling the truth, because, you know, some people imagined a lot of things. I don't think they were deliberately lying, but people's memories play them tricks a lot of the time, and it's very difficult if you just don't know that front and you don't know what the other people have said to know exactly if it is right or not. You get a feel for it in the end, but it did take me a little while. But I suppose in the end, I mean, I think I interviewed about 260 on film, and probably another 1,000 not on film. And obviously the writers had their own ideas of who they wanted filmed. They wanted somebody, say, from Verdun, or they wanted somebody from Arras or Passchendaele. So sometimes I had to go out and look for particular ones.
Did you find that some of them were maybe withholding some of their wartime memories when they spoke to you? Did you get a feeling there were things they weren't telling you for whatever reason?
On the whole, no.
So you felt they were all being really frank about what had happened to them?
I think so. That's what we wanted. I mean, there has been a suggestion, I think, in the Telegraph, that we didn't want emotion in the film. That is, of course, complete and absolute nonsense. That is what we wanted. I don't know quite where that idea came from, but it is fundamentally untrue. If you look at the Great War interviews, the films, you will see that there's just a lot of emotion in it. And we wanted something that wasn't the history. The writers were telling the history. We wanted the men to say how they'd reacted to it, what had happened to them, where they'd been, what it had been like, what their friends were like. You know, the thing is, they couldn't really make friends because they were so afraid if they made a friend really close to them that they would get blown up and it would be just too upsetting. So they didn't dare really get very, very close.
Do you think for some of them it was quite a cathartic experience to talk to you and to talk to the programmes?
I think it perhaps was. I think maybe that they hadn't talked about it very much before, but it may have been a cathartic experience. It was certainly a very moving experience for me. I was deeply moved by it, and of course there were some who came and I interviewed them, and one of them had been at Passchendaele, and he was an art teacher at Rugby School, and he was a very sensitive man. And what I used to do was I would light them from the front, and I wouldn't be lit. So it was like I was in darkness, and they were there with the photo blow-up of whatever battle we were talking about. And they could really concentrate. And I realised, just before the film ran out actually, because we were working on 16mm film and blew it up to 35 to make it look more grainy, so that it matched in with the archive footage. And I realised just before the film ran out that he wasn't here. He'd disappeared completely into some other world. Where he was back at Passchendaele. And I thought, what shall I do? I can't say cut or anything because it may be a shock to him. I think I'm just going to have to wait till he wakes up. So I sat there and we all waited in silence. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio at Ealing. And finally he woke up and said, "Where am I?"
He's almost gone into a trance.
He'd gone into a trance. He had gone into a trance.
Do you think that some of this kind of emotional response you were getting from some of these people, does that counter this image we have of the stiff upper lip, that people just sort of dealt with these things and carried on, do you think?
Oh no, we had a lot of stiff upper lip people too.
But they weren't universal though. There was a divergence, was there?
What I think, and what the conclusion I came to, that in a lot of cases the regular officers were stiff upper lip, but the volunteers who came from all walks of life and from all kinds of backgrounds, who hadn't been trained in the army, noticed everything that was going on around them and spoke on the whole rather better, certainly more emotionally on the whole. As it wasn't a rule. I mean, obviously it varied, but that was my observation at the time.
And did you notice a difference? Because it wasn't just British veterans, I noticed there were German veterans, for example. Did you notice a difference between how they spoke about the war from the British people?
Not particularly. I interviewed several in Hamburg, actually. The Germans were interviewed in Germany, the Americans in America, the French in France. Not in a particular way. We have an absolutely wonderful man called Westman, who was a doctor later. I'm not sure what he was during the war, but he was such a wonderful speaker and he was so sensitive. And it was interesting to find, you see, that the truth is they didn't hate each other. They were sorry for the people on the other side in the trenches opposite also.
So there was quite a universal feeling among...
Well, you know, we've got the story Henry Williamson tells of the Christmas truce. And they came across, this was Christmas 1914, and they came across and shook hands and sang Silent Night and exchanged addresses and all these kind of things, and they were sorry for each other, you know. A lot of the time they didn't want to kill. Westman says he really regretted having to kill.
Well, one thing I thought was really interesting that I saw was when you interviewed some of the women at home. Did they, because I know some of them seemed to have quite a stiff upper lip as well, do you think that was, they were told they had to carry on with life and this is just what happened?
I think there was probably an attitude at that period of just get on with it and don't complain. Mustn't complain.
Nowadays we're quite used to having these kind of series where you interview lots of veterans or people who went through something. But at the time, was this quite a groundbreaking series in the way it was done?
I believe so, yes. I think it probably was.
And did that have a big effect on how your future media career and the way you went about things in future?
I think I did quite a lot of my own interviewing, and I would rather do that than have a front person, you see. So I started making my little mood films where I could just go out and do little films and things. But then I did a lot of archaeology and quite a bit of history and one thing and another and a bit of drama, and so it was quite broad.
What's your reaction to this new film and the fact that this is all being broadcast again for the 100th anniversary? How did you feel about that?
Well, I think Detlef Siebert, who did it, made it, put it together, has done a lovely job on it, and I find it deeply moving, and I shall watch it again on Friday.
What do you hope that people around the country sort of living in the 21st century will take away from watching this programme and then maybe revisiting the original series?
Well, I hope they'll learn what wonderful people these were and what they've done for our future, and I hope they will come away with a sense of pride in them.
That was Julia Cave, and as I mentioned earlier, I Was There is to be broadcast tomorrow, Friday the 14th of March, on BBC Two at 9 p.m, and it should be available on the iPlayer after that. Also on the iPlayer, you can now watch extended interviews with the veterans from the series in a collection curated by Sir Max Hastings, who himself was a researcher on the Great War. And that's almost all for this week. Do get in touch with your views about the podcast on podcast@historyextra.com, and we'll do our best to read out some of those in future episodes. And you can keep in touch with us on social media. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/historyextra, and you can follow us on Twitter @historyextra. Plus do make sure to visit our website, historyextra.com, for lots of history news, features, image galleries, quizzes, and a whole lot more. Next week we'll be joined by Ben McIntyre to talk about Cold War espionage, while Thomas Dixon will be exploring the history of friendship. Do join us for that. This History Extra podcast was recorded on location in Kent and London and produced by Jack Fletcher.